Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jake Milstein. Welcome to this urgent panel discussion, cybersecurity impacts of the Russia-Ukraine situation. Obviously, a very, very tense situation over there. I want to be clear that today we're going to focus on the cybersecurity impacts. Now, we're going to get into, of course, some of the mindset of the leaders and how it affects cybersecurity. One thing we're not going to get into as much as sort of the humanitarian aspect of what's going on. So just to keep this discussion, in the guardrails, we'll be talking about cybersecurity. As people get into the room here, I want to thank everybody for joining us. For this urgent panel discussion. We started doing urgent panel discussions a little more than a year ago when there were a bunch of ransomware attacks that happened all at once. And one of our customers actually suggested to us, hey, you guys should tell people about that. You guys should do we want to talk about it with somebody. And so we started doing urgent panel discussions when the need arose, when things happened around the world or in the US that necessitated it. And what's happened is, the first one we did had 20 or 30 people. And as we've done these, our wonderful partners have begun inviting people, and more people have come. And the feedback is generally good. At the end of this, we'll obviously ask for your feedback as well. The goal for today is to talk, to educate, and then to answer your questions and listen to you. And we'll talk about that here in a second. So one thing to know, on the right-hand side of your screen is a chat. There's a little bubble. You can click on the chat. It looks like people are already saying hi, which is terrific. The chat is sometimes where the most exciting things happen. Ask your questions. I'll answer your questions as they come up. If I miss a question, and some of our consultants will also be in the chat to answer questions as they come up. You can mute the chat. Sometimes there's a lot of, especially with this many people coming into a webinar, you get a bing, bing, bing. I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. You will get a recording of this. So the system should automatically email you a recording, but it's a system. And if it doesn't email you a recording, then email me, jake@criticalinsight.com, and I'll make sure you get a recording. And we'll put this on our YouTube channel as well. So our agenda today, we're going to talk about what we know. We're going to talk about headlines, and we're going to talk about how to prepare your organization for what might be coming. If you take a look here, this is how you mute notifications. This is the least interesting part of the presentation, but important anyway. So you click Enter Full Screen on the bottom, then you select More, then you select Mute All Notifications, and then you exit that. When you click the Exit button, no, you're not going to exit the presentation. You just exit the full screen mode. You can even leave it in full screen mode, whatever you want. There you go. Okay, so who we are. Critical Insight defends critical services against cyber attacks. The critical industries we serve include hospitals, utilities, financial institutions, cities, counties that are essential to everyone's daily life. We're their security operations center. We watch networks 24/7 and stop and spot attacks so they can continue to deliver critical services. We have a special guest joining us today as well as Bryan Hurd. Bryan, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Bryan Hurd. I'm the Chief of Office for Stroz Friedberg out of Seattle. I work together with Mike, Fred, and Jake. I'm part of the Aon Global Corporation, and the reason I'm here today, besides being a partner of the Critical Insight team, is also I used to run the cybersecurity defense for U.S. European Command. I helped set up some of its programs, and I work cyber breaches all around the world. I founded the U.S. Navy Cyber Counter-Espionage Program in the early 90s, and recently was Microsoft's Chief of Global Cybercrime Intelligence. So I want to thank everybody for coming all from around the world, and a special hello to Maximilian in my favorite place on the planet, Munich, Germany. Thanks for joining this evening for you. I hope to get back to Garmisch-Partenkirchen soon to be talking to the George C. Marshall Center. So thanks for staying up late and joining us. Back over to you to run the room, sir.
All right, Mike.
So Mike Hamilton, and I go back about 30 years in information security. before starting the company with Fred here and some other folks. Spent about 10 years in government as the CISO of the city of Seattle, as a policy advisor to Washington State, and as the vice chair of a government coordinating council for Homeland Security. Prior to that, it was all the private sector. I was the managing consultant for VeriSign Global Security. And I go way, 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 way back in time, back to when Fred Langston and I used to hand roll firewalls and sell them in Southern California.
Speaking of Fred.
Yeah. So yeah, I run the professional services team here at Critical Insight. Been running consulting groups for about 20 plus years now. Interestingly, I always like to talk about our IR team because they haven't slept in the last 2 years, and I expect them to get even less sleep with the activities going on right now. So.
Great. And IR, I know we have folks from some folks in IT, some folks in security, some folks not. IR is incident response, which is when you call the 800 number in the middle of the night, you call Bryan, you call us. That's not how we want to meet anybody. So again, my name is Jake Milstein. I host our events. I'll be asking the questions today and leading the discussion. So we're going to start here with headlines. And here are 6 headlines, and we're going to go through them. And these are just headlines from the last couple of days. So the first one here, guys, FBI and CISA warn of destructive malware targeting organizations in Ukraine. And this is Killware. I think the thing everyone wants to know is it coming here? So Mike, let's start off with you.
Okay.
You know, what's Killware and what's going on here?
So the other term for this is that you will see in the media is a wiper. And it works the same way ransomware does. It's going to come in and it's going to lock up your network so that you can't operate. But the thing that's missing is likely going to be an extortion demand, because they're not really interested in money. They just want to knock down the network. And there's a variant of that where they actually do extort for money, but then you don't get your network back. So, either way, you've lost your network. And, interestingly, there are a couple of cases. There's one right now, Expeditors is down. Expeditors is a major link in our supply chain, right? It's a logistics company, gets product from manufacturer to consumer. Well, they're not saying a lot about what happened. They have suggested ransomware, but we know that they're rebuilding from backup, which means they didn't pay a ransom or there was none demanded. So that could be the sign of wiper, killware, whatever you want to call it, starting to be used surgically against organizations in the US that would have an outsized impact on our economy.
And Bryan, when we think about, what the FBI warning about this, what's the danger here that Russia unleashes it on Ukraine and then?
Yes, exactly what we saw in the last conflict with Ukraine with Maersk, similar to Expeditors, where they had a Ukrainian subdivision that had a piece of accounting software in native Ukrainian language that was targeted by the Russians to try and infect those companies in the conflict region. And what happened is, you call it, unanticipated consequence, stray voltage, or collateral damage. It then went from the local subsidiary up chain to the mothership. And so we have many clients I'm working with who have either 1,200 staff in the Ukraine. They're trying to physically protect them, but they're also locking down and putting further watertight compartments in the organization to make sure any weapons that target maybe Ukrainian subsidiaries, developers, or suppliers don't accidentally come up the wire.
And that's called the NotPetya attack. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit because there are a lot of folks worried about that. The second headline here, Russia-Ukraine war, phishing, malware, hacker groups are now taking sides. Fred, this is happening worldwide.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch how some hacker groups are literally splitting in half, with some halves of them starting to take the sides of the Ukrainians or the free world, maybe you might say. Other ones are sticking to their Russian overlords. The interesting component of this is how much is the Russian government directing this? How many of these ransomware groups really are in it for the money, care that much about the geopolitical component? And are they also going to take advantage of the chaos to conduct more just financial ransomware operations as well. So there's a whole bunch of wild cards. Things are still splitting. Nobody knows where these bad guys are all going to land.
And Mike, Anonymous has gotten involved now.
They have, and they actually, so I think more than just Anonymous, there are activist groups that are, as we say, taking sides here. Anonymous being one of those, but that's not it. And so there's a lot of people that feel right now that it's fair game to start shooting at Russia, cyber shooting at them. And that really has the potential for things to get out of hand. I've actually heard that there is in fact, I'll just say it's because it's in the news. NVIDIA apparently got hit with ransomware and they smacked back pretty hard. So, the gloves seem to be coming off, but Anonymous, yeah, they were able to take control of some Russian broadcasting. And in addition to, slogans that were pro-Ukraine, they also put up there the number of Russian soldiers that have been killed, which Russians are not being told about, right? I've been told that people in Russia are, constantly hearing that this is a humanitarian effort. And the Russian soldiers that went in, didn't know why people were shooting at them. Okay, well, that's just complete disinformation running rampant in Russia. And the fact that Anonymous then started making this stuff public, that really has the potential to move the needle in terms of Russian opinion and what could potentially be a Julius Caesar moment coming up.
But let's talk about the possibility there. I mean, you even before this happened, Mike, you have your prediction for 2022 was this was going to be the year that we had to worry about cyber activism more than previous years.
Yes.
How let's say I'm joining this and I am, at a credit union, I'm at a hospital, I'm at a city. How does that go? Like, why should I care?
Well, because once that genie is out of the bottle and people have done that, they've joined, some loose organization where for a social cause, right, we can package it that way, they go after somebody. Well, there's all kinds of social causes that'll come out of the woodwork, not the least of which is the upcoming elections. Mm-hmm. And so again, this has the potential to jump the fence and really kind of get out of control.
And I to put it in context to cyber, while it feels good to, start thinking you're part of a battle team. I've run offensive and defensive operations against the Russians and others in times of peace and somewhat unpeace. Picture this: a Canadian, American, or German kid takes a rifle and shoots a Russian leader. Is it as fun as the cyber discussion? It's an act of war. The other question becomes, if it's pertinent in this case, what other cases are non-controlled assets now in the battlefield, potentially bringing, liability down upon the countries they operate from? Another terrestrial example, Al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. from Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan for 20 years. The non-state actors putting on state-level hats, while I may agree with their goals, don't get me wrong, is a dangerous place for us all to be having a discussion, especially because you take out information is one thing. You take out an electrical grid in a Russian city, you could be killing a lot of people who are actually on your side because you don't know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And you don't have the right authorities or abilities to do it or correct it.
And that would constitute the first shot against Russia, which would allow them to retaliate in kind, right? We don't want to do that first, which is why, activist groups doing this, but on the other hand, we know that Russia co-ops its, its criminal gangs to do so. I mean, they're doing the same thing, right? So, I mean, it's a very gray line there, but yeah, I mean, if something happens in this country, it's going to be packaged to look like organized crime. Why? Because the alternative would be firing the first shot against a NATO country, and Article 5 doesn't mess around, right? One NATO country gets picked on, they're all going to swarm. And we can see how they're swarming now with a non-NATO country, and we know that we have to keep kind of out of the shooting war because they're not NATO and we don't have, the legal underpinnings for that. But the first shot that gets fired, even if it's a cyber shot, that could blow up.
Agreed. And the other thing is, for those of you who ever run an operation or run sources and confidential informants, you're responsible for the crimes they commit. So they, again, I'm as Jake so laid out. This is a humanitarian horrible crisis. This is an evil happening in war. But we're here today to talk about kind of both the overarching and then what you can do about it in terms of your own, local civil defense capabilities for the people on.
Yeah,
So
and
agreed, absolutely.
And Bryan, when we were preparing for this, you were the one who called out this next one, which is Kremlin Deputizes Conti ransomware gang. You were interested in that. And then Fred, I know your team right now is responding to some ransomware. I don't know if it's Conti, but we're going to talk about we're going to talk about that in a second. Bryan, you wanted to talk about this one.
So I work I work mega breaches all over the planet. I'm working a bunch now in terms of helping clients and things like that. And between DarkSide, Conti, and all, they're Russian inspired and Eastern European usually based. You got some North Korea, you got some Nigeria, you got some others. They'll do this to curry favor for the safe haven upon which they operate. So what they also, this is the same group, if you all remember, that said, we're not going to hack hospitals. The next day I had 2 hospitals I had to go work cases on.
Mm-hmm.
So they're only doing, they don't care. They're doing it for profit. They're doing it for safe haven. They're doing it for other things, or they're trying to have you turn your anger towards somebody else, as opposed to what the FBI and others have been doing to actually find, extradite, and arrest these people for being what they are, purely criminals. They're trying to sidle up next to the nation state to maybe scare you from enforcement.
And Fred, even before this happened, we were seeing another uptick in ransomware. Kremlin deputizing the Conti ransom gang certainly doesn't make folks feel any better.
Yeah, well, there's an interesting kind of blowback potential there as well, that you can be labeled an enemy combatant if you bring yourself into this. And that takes a ransomware gang from, hey, they're going to come after and arrest us, to, hey, they might actually drop a bomb on us, because you have now become enemy combatants and you have a different category which the government considers you, and you're a legitimate target for being killed as opposed to being arrested. So that could change things a little bit. And I think the other interesting thing about Conti is that's one of the main organizations that had a breach of internal messaging within the gang by part of that gang that didn't agree and decided they weren't going to be part of the Russian effort, and they're actually, or at least appearing to side with the free world by exposing a bunch of the hidden communications within the Conti gang. So that's an interesting kind of twist to this. Is I don't think everybody in those gangs really wants to play ball and become an enemy combatant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see a couple of questions in the chat here. Michael saying all this scary speculation is important. What do we do with that? I promise we're going to get to that. I think we need to understand the threat a little bit here. One of the things I will mention is when we get to the part of the discussion about how do you talk to the other folks in your organization about it, we developed some tools for you to do that. Let me the next two, Mike, are sort of linked. Ukraine calls on Hacker Underground to defend an attack, which is a little bit of the cyber activism thing. And then U.S. Prepared to respond to Russian cyber attacks, says Biden. I think, we've talked about both of those. I think there's, two questions. One, what would that response look like from the U.S.? And second is, what does that matter if you're a financial institution, a bank, or a financial institution, a hospital, a
doesn't matter at all. Does not matter at all. Okay, so look, Russia is not going to start knocking down our electric grid. Ain't going to happen. Is not going to happen unless he's crazy, and he might be crazy. And he might be so backed up against the wall that he pulls all kinds of triggers that we didn't think he was going to do. Okay. But here is the fact of the matter. The GDP of Russia is $1.4 trillion a year. The US, $21 trillion a year. It's reported that $6 trillion a year is the cost of cybercrime globally. Okay. All right. Well, let's say half of that is indirect costs from paying people like Bryan to right the ship, and fines, maybe shareholder lawsuits, brand damage. Okay. Let's say that accounts for half of that 6 trillion, which is probably generous.
Actually, let me offer one. I wish I'm not that expensive. Two, the ransom and the response is usually about 8 to 15%. It's the regulatory and fines that make up the other 85. Just I would love to have the 3 trillion, but that's not me.
Well, the point of the matter is, in an economy that has a $1.4 trillion GDP, what's leaving the United States and going as a direct theft cost to Russia is probably doubling their GDP. So Putin has had the crap smacked out of him with sanctions, and they're going to hurt the economy like crazy. What do you think is going to happen? This is not hard to predict. If you're a financial institution, if frankly you're anybody that's got money, cybercrime is going to go way up. Why? They need the money, and there is an infrastructure that's already there. So when they say they deputized the Conti ransomware gang, what are they going to do? They're going to start knocking down the energy grid? No, they're going to steal money. So, this is, and Mike here is asking, well, what's actionable here? Well, you just got a piece of threat intelligence that tells you this is going to tick up. Okay, whatever you thought your threat profile was before, it just got squared, right? So, frankly, that's a piece of information that you can act on. Now, what are we capable of doing to the Russians? Exactly what they do to us, right? But firing that first shot is something we're not going to do. So it reported all the time. They have a toehold in our energy infrastructure. We find them every once in a while. If they wanted to pull that trigger, they could. We have the same thing in their energy infrastructure. All right. Mutually assured cyber destruction is not anything anybody wants. It's going to be crime. It's going to look like crime. There will be surgical strikes, again, against organizations that have a giant impact on the economy, right? Like Expeditors. And I've got some other examples of things that have been going on too. But don't freak out about Russians coming to knock down all the critical infrastructure, because with high probability, I can say that is not going to happen.
Yeah, and Mike, you got to the last one here, which is Russian criminals attacking strategic targets. Which seems to already be happening, as you mentioned there. I do want to get to, so before this started, we talked about 3 possibilities here. Number 1, and mentioned it, the supply chain attack results in global collateral damage. Number 2, the Russian criminal gangs attack on behalf of Russia. And number 3, U.S. critical infrastructure is attacked. And one of the things that the articles in the last 24 hours have really started to bring up is that some folks in Russia might have been surprised by the sanctions, that they feel backed into a corner and they didn't think the world would react this way. Others have brought up, there's a New Yorker article about and an article in the Hill this morning about Putin's mental state. Brings up COVID-19 isolation. I'm that last one worries me, but Bryan, can you talk about these 3 possibilities and where you think this is going?
Yeah, happy to. I think the first 2 are insanely more likely, and again, either intentionally or as an overall part of the conflict. We've seen Moscow and Russia turn off power grids, attack Ukrainian infrastructure, things like that. You could anticipate that would be done should they turn their attention to the Balkans and at the geopolitical level. Now, here's a couple of issues. What can you do? And then I'll get to critical infrastructure. What can you do about that stray voltage issue? Keep close, even if you're a small, plucky group, to the vulnerabilities that come out over the next couple of weeks that may be abused or are being abused in this conflict. Make sure you're patching them or doing the things you can, not to be the person caught a week later. There's times when, like with last time, that the tools the Russian used were compromised NSA tools. Not happy about that. We used to use those pretty effectively. They were compromised, but it took criminal groups a long time, weeks or months, to come up with exploits. So be ahead of the known knowns, and then be looking out for some of those things. Those will not allow, like the standard security you're already doing is going to stop standard ransomware. They're looking for easy hits. They're looking for quick money, Mike indicated. Attacks on critical infrastructure, again, if they start trying to actually inflict direct material harm on the US population, it ups the game in a way that even crazy people to a degree do have some kind of self-preservation instinct to a point until they're cornered, like in World War II or other things, and they'll just down the whole game. But they plan to run their country for years after this. They're just trying to expand it. So I'm hoping we don't get to that third one. I am concerned that wannabes or non-state driven assets will take it upon themselves and up this game.
Yeah,
and that would be
That's a
the way
good
I see
point.
and Fred, how do you see those three?
Well, I'm going to say that if you follow Fiona Hill, who was one of the national experts on Russia, testified in the impeachment hearings, and is probably one of our best Russia experts, has said flat out that she expects Putin to take every possible and use every possible tool he has at his disposal. She sees him as somebody who is definitely willing to take steps that others won't, with the thought that I'll do it and they'll be so terrified of the escalation path of potentially ending up in nuclear war that we will not respond in kind. So I'm going to say that I'm of the mind that if this goes poorly, and it doesn't look like it's going swimmingly so far, but if in a month from now it goes really poorly, I would not rule out attacks on critical infrastructure. I think if it looks like they're going down, he's going to want to leave a very painful mark on the world for his failure.
Well, and I mean, what we're seeing right now, the ruble is now, way, I forget what it's way down. I forget what the percentage is. How long does that take, Fred, do you think, before he reacts like that, if that happens?
Well, it all depends on how hard the oligarchs lean on him. He's got all the money he needs. He's got all the luxury built in his castles, apparently he has. But the oligarchs do care. And if the oligarchs start leaning on him, that will change the equation very, very quickly. We already know some oligarchs have come out and said, we're not really for this war. We think it's a mistake. The fact that they're publicly saying that in a place where everyday Russians can hear that, that's a pretty strong motivator, I think, for him to maybe show some restraint and potentially try to find a way out where and remember, he may, do this in slow bites, right? He'll back up to Donbass. That's all he'll stay in. Then for 2 years, he'll try to extend it a little bit farther. I think this is a slow, biting the elephant, one bite at a time. I don't think he's actually expecting to take all of Ukraine in one big fell swoop.
Yeah, I mean, Vern says in the chat, this is part of Putin's playbook. He's been on this path for many years, predating COVID. This is not out of character for what we've seen him in the past. Maybe, although he also just recently said he had no interest in invading Ukraine. So, I mean, I think the, CISA saying shields up, this is something different, I think is is one of the reasons that we're doing this. So Bryan, earlier you mentioned not Petya. Mike, can you give a little history of this? Because I think this is a really important thing for people to understand why something that happens in Ukraine can spiral out of control here.
Yeah, I think so. This is probably the most famous example of compromising an organization that has a product that they send out to all their customers, compromising that product, sending it out globally, and then having the thing get out of control. Well, that's exactly what happened. Russia wanted to poke Ukraine in the economy, so they compromised, just like the SolarWinds software was compromised and everybody had the problem. Well, this was a tax preparation software company, and they compromised that piece of software. It got distributed, and because a lot of companies that have to do business with Ukraine were required to use that software, everybody got flattened. So, and in fact, this is going to be a good pivot to Bryan here, because one of the pieces of fallout from this just got resolved, but shipper Maersk lost $300 million and was down for a long time. Merck, the drug manufacturer, the list goes on and on and on. There was a retailer in the EU that couldn't operate for the longest time. Bryan, you want to talk about, and this is interesting, the cyber war exclusion and how that just kind of panned out?
So without, and again, I work for Aon, a global insurance company, and we even had an incident that was in the headline over the about last day or two. But I'm sitting here on the panel, so that's my opinion on that. The issue we've seen in these things is, one, that was a property policy. Silent cyber was what's known as silent. In other words, some policies, like your homeowner's policies, cover listed perils and anything else not excluded. Now, none of us have ever read our homeowner's policy. Yeah, I know. Until I found water in my basement, I didn't either. So that's one of the issues. Now, the other issue becomes there are insurance policies for acts of war. There are insurance policies for global terrorist attacks. I helped work to a degree the case with the World Trade Center with I was at EDS. We helped do some of the forensics around whether it was one attack or two for the insurance industry, 3.1 or $6.2 billion in coverage. So just like with anything else, there's a lot of discussion here. It takes having the right person that understands it, helping you and your organization. But there's, if you can insure, a golf player's arm or a quarterback's arm, you can insure a company for anything on a list. Lloyd's and others will do that. But I do think what you're seeing now with only Maersk, everybody remember the 2013 Target breach? Still having court cases, still having liabilities, still talking about fines 9 years later. Imagine being the CISO who's called back into court to testify. So these things are, the long tail of the breach is actually much, much worse than the actual ransom. So the Maersk was a $300 million write down and another $188 million for one of the subsidiary, the related companies. And they've been going through court to try and get coverage at their primary, coverage on business interruption, coverage on cyber, looking at all the policies around. So that's the short version. Again, I both do the cyber smoke jumper, as we call them, and I help with the insurance stuff. So if there's more questions, we can either go into depth later or do a follow-up, but glad to talk about it.
Yeah. And so now, earlier, Michael in the chat said, hey, this is all scary, but what do we, how do we prepare? Exactly. So, so let's talk about preparation and let's talk about what people should be doing right now. I'm going to get back to insurance in a second, but, Fred, I know you're advising, customers, clients, right now. What should folks be doing? Are we checking for vulnerabilities or doing special employee trainings? Like what is it? What should people be doing right now?
Yeah, so it's pretty much the standard things. I mean, you need to make sure you're staying on top of any critical vulnerabilities, especially if they're exposed externally on the internet. You need to make sure people are getting the full training, and I would focus on things that may have, some flavor of Russian phishing attacks or something of that nature. Obviously, they're going to look like something else, but you want people at their highest level of alert. And the other thing I think people may want to look at is monitoring network traffic for signs of distributed denial of service. That's the one thing that has taken off in the last 3 months is distributed denial of service attacks. And we know that's a huge part of what they're using actually on the ground in Ukraine. They're not doing, they have some wipers. I think it was, I can't remember the name of Wondergate or something like that, was Whispergate was one of the ones they're using as a wiper right now. But what the number one attack is distributed denial of service attacks, right? Because they want to close off the ability for organizations to communicate, to receive inbound and communications. So I would suggest that, especially if you're a large target, you might want to look at monitoring network traffic and look for signs of DDoS. And the other part to that is if you are relying on major services like AWS, Azure, that may be the victims of DDoS, you may want to look for other ways to have continuity of operations, meaning maybe you don't want to be in just one major kind of cloud provider or something like that.
And, Mike, what do you have to add to that? How do folks prepare?
So first of all, use this information to determine whether or not you think you could potentially be targeted. So just a couple more things that have happened. So there's a couple of satellite internet providers that are down in Ukraine right now. That is to cut off communications. Obviously, one of the casualties has been this network of 6,000 wind turbines that are still operating, but they can't get remote access to it, which means that if anything goes wrong, they have to send technicians out there, and they don't scale well that way. So they're hitting fuel. Okay, why? Because Nord Stream 2 pipeline is now not a thing. Okay, here's the other thing. We said weeks ago, the Biden administration said, we will look for alternative sources of energy to compensate for that Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Well, if we were going to compensate, what are we going to do? We're going to ship it over there, right? And it has to be stored. So what gets flattened with Wiper over in Germany? A fuel storage tank company that handles about 20% of the energy supply for Germany and greater Europe. So again, surgical things that are strategic to fight back against the sanctions. So if you are in, for example, oil and gas, radar up, right? This threat intel that you're getting right now tells you that you are likely on the short list of targets.
Mike, in support of that, if I may, oil and gas in region is one thing. If you're oil, and I'm working a couple cases of oil and gas right now, as you are, we talked about to prep for this. The fact that they're getting hit, that might be where the weaponized invoice comes from. That might be a person that shares HR systems with you because they do oil platform resumes for everybody in the industry. It's the second island hop that's unintentional, that is exactly to take, and again, it's come up in the chat and we all talked about this, to take global strategic issues, be like, okay, what do I need to do when I go back to work after spending time with you all on this webinar? Look for those kind of things. Like, do you have any hooks into stuff you're one hop away from something that might be an issue? Do you like look at your vulnerabilities? Maybe take an extra backup and just kind of put it extra offline just in case there's any kind of global tsunami or some stray voltage. But I'll hand the mic back, but I just wanted to hit that. That's kind of how you take, news, weather, and sports and turn it into, what are you going to do in your fitness program?
Yeah. And Mike, I want to go to something you said earlier when we we're talking about headlines, which is, okay, there are all these economic sanctions being imposed on Russia. The value of the ruble is going down. Both the gangs and Russia are going to need money. Yep. Do they target U.S. financial institutions? Where do you see that going?
Yeah, I think they're going to target U.S. financial institutions, and CISA and the FBI keep saying the same thing. So let us remember that the North Koreans use as a tactic ransomware to fund a weapons program. That's where we're landing here, except this weapons program costs a lot more money. And to Bryan's point, okay, about how you may be victim number 2 in a chain, this is a real good time to talk to your vendors, and at a minimum, if something happens to you, you got to tell us, right? I mean, this is just a simple communication to make to all your vendors, service providers, everybody you're doing business with. Something happens to you, we need to know, right? Doesn't have to be contractual. Please, let's all work together. I can tell you too that because we can publicly disclose things like, kind of generally what we see in Pisces data, right? Which is the free monitoring for local governments that we use to teach analysts. We are seeing an uptick in domestic sources attempting exploits. So it's not coming from Russia. It's going to come from compromised computers here, or frankly, they just use a cutout company to buy AWS time, and they'll attack you from there,
somebody
right?
in the chat said, I'm turning off all web traffic from Russia and Ukraine.
That's not going to work, right? Two, remember, one of the tactics that's in use right now is living off the land. So it's not noisy malware that fires off, right? If I can get somebody stupid to give me a password with a phishing page, I'm just going to walk into the network, right? Most of you, if you're not using multi-factor authentication, shame on you.
Right.
But then they use tools that are, administrative tools they always use. So locking down PowerShell is a super good idea right now. I mean, really restrict access to that. I would say that, this never let a good crisis go to waste. This is, hold on, this is a really good time right now to implement a policy of separating personal and business use, okay? Personal use on a personal device. Because right now, we just got a report, Yahoo's getting pounded and people are getting, the second factor on their phone. Hey, somebody's trying to log into your Yahoo account. Personal email is a whole lot easier to get through than Office 365, and with all of the controls there. So there's a few things right there. Lock down PowerShell, talk to your vendors. If you can, separate personal and business use and monitor that network and look specifically for an uptick from domestic sources coming in, because that means somebody's looking at you.
Brian, you had something to add there.
Yeah, quick hits to reflect. And again, drill in on any of them that the team wants, but I want to give airtime. One, are they going to attack the financial institutions? Yeah, kind of. However, 2 quotes. One, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. 2, it's a Hezbollah quote. Why hunt lions when there are sheep about? Now, I know the other one was the bank robber. I'm saying the second one was the Hezbollah quote. Why hunt lions when there are sheep about? I can take $10 million from an oil company or a cloud services company a lot easier than I can try and hack through Morgan Stanley or anybody. And one of the guys that posted, Aon had published an 8K on Friday. We had a cyber incident. The other thing I'll say is global corporations have many units, and that internal segmentation. For those of you that are Navy like me, it's watertight compartments on a ship. 1 watertight compartment is not going to be a problem. 7 is, it sinks the Titanic, or 6. Somebody will correct me in the chat, I'm sure. And if you're a forestry type, fire breaks and things. If you're a hotel person, fire breaks, sprinklers, and those. Same in cyber. Mike is listing the smoke detectors, sprinkler systems, radon detectors in your kids' bedrooms. Try and buy a car without an airbag.
So, and I want to go back to the chat here. So earlier, Darren asked a question, which is for small, and Mike mentioned monitoring. For smaller facilities that cannot afford things such as a remote security operations center or a SIM tool, would something like Security Orion and other open source tools be acceptable for security monitoring?
Security
I'll say
Onion.
Oh, did I say Orion? Ooh, I just read it wrong. Sorry. Bad. Anyway, would that work? Number one. And number two, I'll say, we do provide that service. And if you want us to make it work for your budget, let me know. But, Mike, how would you answer that? And sorry for the misreading.
I would answer that yes. I mean, there's all kinds of open source tools that, in the absence of anything else, build yourself an elk stack. Use Security Onion, right? There's a couple of open source SIMs. Mozdef is one of those from Mozilla. OSIM is one that's the open source variant of Alien Vault, I believe. It's open source. Set it up. Point your logs at it. Unfortunately, that stuff takes an enormous amount of care and feeding to get it to work really well.
In the interim, if you are a small organization and can't upgrade to that, talk to Mike and his team about your endpoint protection and having it in auto fire mode. Don't install it and then don't allow it to quarantine files. Things like Sophos sometimes, and different may vary, stop the encryption on an endpoint or a server if they're installed and configured correctly. So while you may not be able to up level and have great teams like Mike and Fred and Jake watching your 6 24/7, do the things they recommend between now and then to mitigate in various ways to stop if you don't have MFA, spend your time doing that on everything. And somebody put in the chat, yes, deprovision all of the service accounts out of your as possible. Microsoft published some great points on how to do that. There's very few that need to be in there, and they can be deprovisioned and reduced. So I'll hand it back, but I just wanted to reflect.
Yeah, and there's some other things in the chat. One I think is tied to another question I was going to ask. Ken says, if you're not seeing ransomware, how are they gaining money by attacking financial institutions? Fred, how would you answer that? And then we have a bunch of questions about different pieces of software we'll hit next.
Well, there's always the phishing and business email compromise approach, where I'm going to, compromise an account. I'm going to send emails saying, hey, we have a new account. It's a bank. Here's the number. Obviously, SWIFT will not work, which Russia is no longer, or at least the main banks in Russia can't use SWIFT. But the SWIFT code is usually what they use. They change that, and you're now sending it to a bank in, some other place where you can't get your money back from. The other thing I'd worry about a lot more is SIM swapping, which has taken off in the level of importance. And what they found in Ukraine was like single houses that had 12,000 SIM cards running out of it, stolen SIM cards running out of it to run propaganda operations or to run phishing operations.
Okay.
So they're moving to other techniques. Ways to bypass multi-factor authentication. If your phone gets a code sent to it and somebody's done a SIM swap, they're the one now receiving your code. So I think they're going to move to, the things that are working, and the things that have not been as popular the last year are probably going to become a lot more popular this year.
I had a company taken down. Now this is the SMS codes, and I know Fred was indicating that. For those of you using authentication apps, a SIM swap doesn't carry over all the things. So just to differentiate, SMS authentication. There's also mobile iron and other things where you can securely have work email on a mobile device as opposed to randomly having work email on a mobile device. The other thing I'll say is I worked a case where a disgruntled employee in the US hired a hacker in Britain for 1,000 British pounds, claiming his boss was inappropriate, a pedophile, and then swapped his SIM, took over his G Suite account, his Gmail account, which was the company's G Suite administrator. $100 million company, but the CEO founder still had his keys to the kingdom. And then, of course, also took over his E-Trade account and harassed his own family on Facebook. So taking this out of context of just the Russians, even morons can do this. It was an 18-year-old kid when we finally rolled him up. So it is. There's a lot more for the individuals, but those kind of things, using the phone apps, not SMS, segregating your personal accounts from your business admin, making sure you have mobile iron or some equivalent.
Sure.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to get back to is one of the questions that came up at one point was, and I'm looking at who's in the audience here. There are a lot of IT folks, a lot of CIOs, CISOs, security types. If you need to talk to the CEO, the board about this being a time where you have to talk to all employees, a time where you have to up your security game, a time for all of that. One of the things we did, and I mentioned this earlier in some of these briefings, was to create an executive brief, a Word document that you can use inside your organization that's worded for anyone to read in a business to understand. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. It's a download, the link, because it's a Word document so that you can click it, download it, and then massage it and change it for your organization so that it makes sense for you. Because obviously us writing it doesn't make sense for internal to your organization. So I'm going to put it in the chat there. Elizabeth, Bryan wants to know, was the Aon breach tied to the Ukraine conflict? It didn't appear to be from the article. I don't know if that's something you can talk about, but a couple of people have, since you mentioned the Aon breach, have asked about it.
Oh, believe me, I know this question was going to come up again. I'm still using my email, so if that's any. No, it doesn't seem to be at this point to be related to geopolitical conflict.
Good, great. But let's talk about what happens when there is a breach. Yeah. So let's take all of this to the side and say, okay, we've done everything we can. We even have a SOC. The SOC says either we have a SOC or we don't have a SOC. They've identified there's a breach. Right now is when you should be preparing for that. Fred, Fred and Mike, how do you prepare for that? And then Bryan, let's talk about the insurance implications too.
Well, the first preparation is have an IR plan, have a well-vetted IR plan, and run a tabletop exercise. If you haven't done those two things, you're basically, a sheep, out in the field ready to get eaten. You need to be prepared. You need to understand what to do, and you need to be able to react as quickly as possible because minutes count when you're in the middle of a response. So that's number one. That's the first thing you need to do. Second, you need to make sure that your response team has the tools they need to actually respond rapidly. We find a lot of people have a great plan. They don't know what to really do when it comes down to, hey, I got to use a tool to image this. I need to have a tool to correlate these logs. What would that be? Well, if you don't know, and if you're not trained on it, you're not going to be able to react rapidly, and you're going to bleed out on the street before you get to the hospital. So being prepared is absolutely the first thing that you need to do. I think I'll turn to Bryan for the Next step, which the first question we ask is, do you have cyber insurance? Brian, take it away.
Well, to dovetail on exactly what you're saying is, one, absolutely have a plan in place. Part of that is, and for those of you who are in smaller groups, let me do one little up level. I'll come right back to this. Is pick a North Star. In other words, there's a lot of little 1 and 2 things you can do. Pick a structure for a security program. NIST, whatever your regulatory is. For those of you from the credit unions on the govies, there's a lot of stuff out there where you can pick a strategy and then implement with priority. Now, this leads directly into cyber insurance. To qualify for cyber insurance, 5 years ago, everybody's like, oh, I'll get it because I'm too lazy to do security. Now you can't qualify. The questionnaire for cyber insurance is, the base one is 95 questions deep. Ransomware rider on it is about 20 questions deep. And they're talking about the very things you're seeing in this chat. You know, how many provisioned service accounts do you have? The answer should be almost 0, if not 0. And the underwriters, the people that are writing insurance policies, are asking those questions. You know what a great byproduct of that is? You have an external view of the way we do it. We give you an external view of your credit score as it's calculated by that process to broker for insurance. We're not an insurance company. We're a broker. We broker 2 insurance companies, just for a small nuance for those of you playing along at the policy level. And the other thing I'll say, and there's a ton around that, we can have a whole nother panel on that stuff. Have a team captain's meeting before game day. Like, don't pick your team on Super Bowl Sunday. Because the other thing I'll tell you is, if your house is on fire, you're not the person with the hose, no matter how qualified you are to pour water on things. You're calling your outside counsel. Your outside counsel and you are notifying your insurance. Then you're calling cyber smoke jumpers. We have negotiators. You're not negotiating your own ransom for your own children. We got people for that. They're on the panel. And if you don't have panel insurance, you can still call and people can figure it out. Firefighters aren't in it for the money most of the time. So there's and call Mike and call Jake and Fred. They can figure out how to help you or how all of us could help you. So I think prep before game day. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I mean, so just running through that, you know, things that you guys have said people should be doing right now. You know, have an incident response plan. Test it, make sure it's up to date. I just heard from one company that, yeah, their incident response plan is a call tree, but 3 of those people no longer work at the company. So check it right now, make sure it's right. Number 2 is you know, maybe it's a good time for a tabletop exercise to make sure it's working and make sure people can find it. Number 3 is make sure somebody's watching your network, either somebody internally or you get you get an outsourced SOC, you know, but make sure you know when somebody gets in. And third is, you know, if something bad happens, you know who you're going to call, have that ready to go, know what's in your insurance plan, and be ready with that. Mike, did I miss anything in there?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's be real clear. This is not a time to suggest go make this big investment and put this big control in place, right? I mean, this time is now. This stuff is happening now. Okay. So the easy things to do that will move the needle a lot, bring your executives into the conversation. That's a really good recommendation. Bring your employees into the conversation and invest them in the mission. Okay. Look, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in the world. This has the likelihood of landing on our doorstep. You're going to get phished. We want you to report everything weird, even if it comes in your personal email. Please don't use your personal email and social media on a work computer while there's a war going on and when we've sanctioned one of the combatants, okay? Review your resilience controls. Rather than say, go out and do all this stuff, resilience. Take a punch and get back up off the mat. That's what resilience is, right? Go review how ready are we to get back up off the mat if we get flattened, right? Whatever you got to do, you know, and again, now there's not a whole lot of time to go get some budget, go through a procurement, put controls in place. No, review what you have now. And if there's anything missing there that you think you could, you know, sand off some edges or do a little extra backup or have a domain controller that's up to date and offline so that you can plug it in when you need to. And now I hate to say this part, but I need to say this part. You probably want to be ready to make a payment using cryptocurrency, because when your insurance company comes in, they are going to make the determination what's the cheapest way for us to get out of this. I hate to say that, that's the business model. So at some point, they will probably guide you through this, but not only being ready to move cryptocurrency, but knowing the prohibited wallets that you cannot send cryptocurrency to because the Office of Foreign Asset Control made it illegal, right? So there's nuance around this. So
yeah, but just so we're clear, because this discussion comes up, and I love that you cue this up in that way. Like, should we go get a Bitcoin wallet?
I'm your guy,
No.
Bryan.
No, not unless you're dealing in Bitcoin. So the short version, there's vendors for this, Killware, Flashpoint, and bunch. They're brought in as part of the cyber smoke jumper team. Believe me, if you have to pay a ransom, there's a company that will handle all the OFAC checks, turning it into Bitcoin. It may not be Bitcoin. It may be one of the other Doge or whatever the hell they're using. Piss me off. But you don't need to go get Bitcoin. But unfortunately, you're going to need to pay for it. And that's where you don't want to be. And there's two types of that extortion. The decryption you can get out of backups, and then them publishing your stuff. We'll talk about that in a future episode, I bet.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. I'll hand it back to you for the closeout.
Yeah, so we're going to do final thoughts here in a second. I do want to share a couple of quick things. Number one is, this is what we do. We are that outsourced SOC, the managed detection response on the left. We can help you with incident preparedness, with 24/7 threat detection investigation, with the incident response. On the right, you have, what Fred's team does with the policy and compliance, pen testing, vulnerability scanning, gap assessment. Bryan's team at Aon does a lot of the things on the right, the incident response. They're great partners with us. And obviously they do insurance and we don't. When you're thinking about, okay, how do I respond to this? Give us a call. We can help. But this is not a sales tool. Just want to let you know what we do. Lastly, I want to give everybody contact information for everybody here. So if you have questions, feel free to email us directly. Also, one of my team members, Jenny, who is our events chief, is going to put a survey in the chat. Please take the survey. We want to know what you thought of this, whether this is helpful and all of that. And as we do that, Mike and Fred and Bryan, let's do some final thoughts here. Bryan, you first.
One, everybody, about 500 of you total or more, thanks for taking time out of your day. Our goal is to leave you with stuff you can do. And the way to think about it is you should be doing these kind of, home improvement, home firefighting, cyber due diligence things. Don't make that wasted effort. It's not about the thing in Ukraine. It's about the overall life of your business for the next Ukraines, for the next things. These behaviors should just be day to day. Yeah, a little extra diligence now during, fire season, but yes. Please reach out to experts you've seen on this call. We're here to help. And thanks for inviting me to this forum. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Fred, final thoughts.
Yeah, well, this was the quickest webinar we've given. We could have done 2 hours on this topic. Easy. The one thing I will say, and I didn't have a chance to mention before, is if you want to survive the modern types of attack, ransomware, data exfiltration, you need immutable backups. That's either offline backups or the newer technologies where the backups cannot be corrupted by the bad guy or encrypted. That is now table stakes. And if you want to recover rapidly, no matter what you do, even if you pay the ransom to keep them from selling your data, you still need this immutable backup approach because, frankly, decrypting data takes longer than recovering from backup. And most people don't realize that it's an incredibly long process to decrypt all your stuff. And it could take 3 weeks when recovering from a backup may take 3 days.
Mike, final thoughts.
So I don't think the Russians are going to come after our critical infrastructure, at least not in an obvious way, not in a way that would leave their fingerprints there, because that's firing the first shot against a NATO country. Ain't going to happen. They are going to run out of money. The way that they bring in a lot of money is they steal it from us, and that's going to go way up, and that's the thing to look for. So you may get ransomware if you're a bank or some kind of other organization. If you're in oil and gas, you may get flattened with no problem, no possibility of getting your stuff back. So use the threat intelligence, right? What we've talked about here to decide what your route is.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. And again, I want to repeat something that we said at the beginning. We didn't cover the humanitarian side of this. That's clearly a different discussion. Second is none of us want to meet you when you call the 800 number on Saturday at 6 a.m. It's not where we want to meet you. So And that's not where you want to meet somebody new either. So anyway, if we can help you, let us know. If Bryan can help, Mike can help, Fred can help, I can help, shoot us an email. Please take the survey. I put the link in the chat there. It is
The chat's cracking me up.
one of the important things about the survey is that it makes what we do better. We take the comments seriously. And we take the feedback seriously, and believe it or not, these events have gotten better. Hopefully, this is the only urgent panel we have to do this year, and nothing else bad happens. My guess is that's unlikely, and we'll get this group back together in a week or two, depending on what happens with this with the Ukraine-Russia situation. All right, everybody, thank you so much. And
Thanks for being here.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Yep.